Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the UBC Learning Circle. Together with the Indigenous Research Support Initiative, we are pleased to be able to bring you all the session Pathways to Indigenous Equity, an Indigenous lens on health systems transformation and research. I'm incredibly honored to be joined here today by these three wonderful and powerful women, Leslie Bonshor, Dr. Brittany Bingham, and Dr. Lindsay Farrell. They're going to lead us in this discussion, and I'm so looking forward to it. Before I get into anything else, I would like to acknowledge that I'm zooming in from the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle. So a gentle reminder here today that the topics we cover can sometimes be sensitive or emotionally triggering. Please make sure you're looking after yourself if that's you. If at any point you feel that you need to talk to a friend, elder, counselor, or family member, please don't hesitate to do so. If you're in need of further resources, you can always check out the Learning Circle website, and we have a number of hotlines that you can access. So, brief introductions. My name is Cole. I'm from the Chawatha First Nation. I'll be facilitating the session today, sharing our digital space, but off camera is Cynthia, our production coordinator, and Julie from URSI. If you feel so inclined, please introduce yourselves in the chat box. We'll kind of get the dialogue started in that way. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to Dr. Lindsay Farrell.
Thanks so much, Cole. On behalf of myself and my co-presenters, we thank the sovereign nations for allowing us onto their territories. And we acknowledge with gratitude that we do our work and reside on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Semiahmoo peoples. This morning while I was having my coffee, sitting on my patio, I was thinking about this acknowledgement, and I was really reflecting on the word allow and how, as Indigenous peoples, we know that to be true. We know and acknowledge that it is a privilege granted to us, not a right, that we reside on another's ancestral territory. So I just wanted to share that teaching with you. We do our work in the hope it will benefit the peoples of these sovereign territories, and also the urban Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit peoples who are our relatives, living resiliently on these traditional territories, and for the betterment of all, as we are one. And just for some introductions, I will pass to Leslie Bonshor.
Thank you, Lindsay, and good morning, everyone. Thank you, Cole, for the warm welcome and introduction. For those that I have not met before, Aiswell, good day. I'm Leslie Bonshor. I am first and foremost grandmother to Carson and Benson, mom to Carly, Clayton, and Riley. I'm an auntie and a sister, a friend, and life partner to Mike. And for work, I'm very fortunate to be able to lead all things Indigenous health at Vancouver Coastal Health. I've been doing that for the past 5 years, 5.5 years. And really, this makes me a little emotional to acknowledge that I'm also now their first Vice President of Indigenous Health as of just a week or so ago. Another acknowledgement of how important this work is. So I'm honored to be the first Vice President of Indigenous Health at Vancouver Coastal Health. And thank you, Lindsay, for already acknowledging I'm calling in from the unceded homelands of Semiahmoo First Nations. I am from the Shatton First Nation, part of the Stalo Nation, and also the Nooksack Indian tribe. On my father's side, the late Siamato, Len Fisher. And on my mother's side, Lori Fisher. I am Italian and a couple other things I'm unsure of at the moment, but we will be doing some research on that side someday. Thank you very much for joining us. And I'm going to pass it over to Brittany now to introduce herself.
Thank you, Leslie. Itakwikwi, Teuk Messiaya, Brittany Chinsquish, Ala Hanechin, Ala Sisha, Stutola, Te Wowok Nachum, Olnoch Chalap Teuk Messiaya. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brittany. I am from the unceded lands of the Sishak people on the Sunshine Coast of BC on my dad's side, mixed European ancestry on my mom's side, and I come from the Wolf clan. I am the Director of Indigenous Research at Vancouver Coastal Health in a joint role with the Center for Gender and Sexual Health Equity. And as Leslie said, I'm also a mom, a daughter, a friend, and really happy to be here today and share with you. I'll pass back to Lindsay.
Thank you. Bonjour, Minogijik Kanawaya, Lindsay Farrell, Indigenous cause. Hello and good morning, everyone. It's lovely to greet you in my language. My name is Lindsay Farrell, and I am an Anishinaabe. My mother is an Anishinaabe, and our homeland is Whitewater Lake in Northern Ontario. And my father is of Irish, English, and Scottish descent. I'm a member of Ebnotung First Nation, and I grew up in Thunder Bay, Ontario. I've been living out here on these beautiful unceded homelands of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh for 6 years. I am currently the Director of Indigenous Wellness, Reconciliation, and Partnerships at Providence Health Care. I'm a sister. I've got 2 older sisters, one in Northern BC and one in Manitoba. And my parents are still together, still hilariously together. They're quite a pair. They are living in Thunder Bay. Right now, my mom is packed and ready to go. She is ready to get in that float plane as soon as the ice breaks and head back up to Whitewater Lake. She keeps sending me photos of the living room with all her stuff packed. So yeah, my thoughts are with my family at this time, and it's just lovely to be able to meet all of you. And thank you so much for joining. I'll pass it to Leslie to kick us off for our conversation today.
Thank you. And next slide, please. So our conversation today, has been 3 Indigenous women leaders in healthcare and a whole bunch of other things. We wanted to be very unique with this experience with all of you. We want to create an opportunity to really open your hearts and minds to our very personal, capital P personal experiences working in healthcare, working in research, trying to disrupt these systems just so gently, but fiercely too, at the same time. So we came up with, and probably somebody else has already come up with this, but we're going to use it, an anti-virtual circle format. So essentially, we're asking you to listen in to these 3 aunties as we share our stories, our perspectives, our experience as Indigenous women doing this work, doing it with great intention. So just really acknowledging and asking you to set aside your phones, log off your emails for just this 90 minutes with us, and to really open your minds and hearts to hearing and listening and taking in what we share, so that it may help you, or that you may reflect on it at a later time. But we're also asking you, please try not to just take words that we use or stories that we tell you. These are our stories. This is what we're sharing. If you need more information, you're more than welcome to reach out to us at another time. But today, just listen and absorb what we're going to share. Thank you so much. And I'm going to hand it back now to, oh no, I'm going to keep going, sorry. I'm going to introduce the first section. So if we go to the next slide, the very first part of this conversation, we're going to talk about and share our experience around decolonizing, and we'll use these air quotes, and you'll learn more about why we do this, because we kind of made up this word and lots of people use it, how we apply a decolonizing lens to health research. And this will give you an opportunity to really see this work through our eyes, through our experience. We're going to start off with Indigenous research approaches, the paradigm shift from individual to collective, with Brittany. Next slide.
Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, this slide refers to a paradigm shift that we really need to consider when we're talking about decolonizing approaches to research. That we need to shift from this individual mindset, which is often present in academia and in our systems, and move towards a more collective, relational, and decolonized approach. and build bridges across collaboration silos, and start to consider critically competition frameworks that exist in this work, as we're all working together towards the same common equity goals. Currently, often measures of success are dependent on the individual, and the structures don't often foster collectiveness or collective knowledge, because most of this work is focused on our individual intellectual property, and often sometimes personal gains or notoriety that we get for doing this work. So, I want us to consider critically these competition frameworks that exist in this work, and whether that's helpful in moving us towards paradigm shifts and moving us towards Indigenous equity and decolonizing. And sometimes even these tenure track systems, or the way our academic systems are structured, doesn't always fit with Indigenous or decolonizing ways of doing the research. For example, a publish or perish mindset focuses on the quantity of the work rather than our community impact or the quality of the work. And further, sometimes even tenure track systems don't focus or value as much the community relationships and the relational approaches that we hold so in such high regard in this work. Next slide.
This is again where we talk about this capital P, how not only personal, and a lot of people say that, oh, this work is very personal to me. I'm so passionate about this subject matter. And that may be true, but are you really related to the people that you're trying to speak on behalf of or participate on behalf of? And that's what we mean when we say capital P, particularly, I think, as I, again, talk about Indigenous women and who we are. Often our research or the subject matter that we're diving into is Indigenous women. And the inherent responsibility, that weight of doing it right and making sure we get it right, or being asked to speak on behalf of all Indigenous women. Like, we just can't possibly do that. But you can just imagine how many times we are asked to do that. So, when we talk about research is personal, and we are researching, like going back to ensure that what we learned from our ancestors, our grandmothers, that we're carrying that forward in a good way. That's what we mean about this research is personal to us. I remember I often share this story about when I first started in healthcare in Fraser Health Authority. And, announcements went out, oh, we've got a new director of Indigenous Health. And of course, we hadn't had that before. And actually, it was called Aboriginal Health then. And word got out, and then my phone was ringing. I had emails asking me to join research projects as that First Nations Indigenous person. And it was troubling because it was like, well, what benefit does that have for the First Nations, the Indigenous people? Because the subject matter area was not something that they were really too interested in. So really trying to switch that around, and that's when Brittany and I first started to work together, was around how do we make sure that the research that we get involved in makes a difference. So if we're going to participate in research, what is the ask? What is the change? Where will it lead to? It's got to lead to a policy change. It's got to lead to something that makes a difference. Because right now, what we keep doing in research is we just keep reporting out devastating data, or we just keep researching to prove what we already know is true. So that's where we talk about this capital P, personal, and why all our relations, everything we do, and Tanya Talega's book, All Our Relations, is so important to read and to understand why all of this is connected. I'm going to ask Lindsay and Brittany to also chime in here about what it means for them when we say capital P, personal.
Thanks, Leslie. As Indigenous women, as Indigenous researchers, we have responsibilities and accountabilities to our communities from our own homelands, and also as visitors on another's ancestral territory. We are accountable to our ancestors. When we introduce ourselves, when we bring our language, when we bring ourselves into a space in a good way, we're bringing all of our ancestors into the room with us. And when you cast something out into the universe, you can't take it back. it's out there. And so we're always wearing two hats where, we have a professional affiliation, which we carry in our day-to-day in our work, but we also carry our Indigenous ways of knowing and being at the same time. I'll just pass to Brittany to comment on some of the research pieces.
Yeah, thank you. We often talk about this amongst Indigenous scholars together about, this deep an inherent responsibility and duty that we have as researchers to be accountable, not only to our relations, but to be accountable to change and to justice. I don't want to speak on behalf of other people, but those that I know closely, we've all gotten into this work because we've seen either the personal experiences of our family members or our communities, or we've seen some injustice or experienced racism in the healthcare system. And that brings us to this work and fuels our personal commitment to the work and to making change. That deep commitment, it means that we're not doing this research because we want to achieve something personally, that this work is all about the collective and all about what we can offer in reciprocity to our communities and to our people. So, the words matter, what we say matters, and how we represent our families, communities, and nations really matter in this work and in research. And it's first and foremost so important to us in this work. Next slide. Oh, this is me. So this is sort of a funny visual here to represent a conversation that has been happening just amongst Indigenous colleagues and friends, and using the metaphor of sprinkles to represent how tokenism happens for Indigenous scholars, for Indigenous people through systems. And this metaphor has often been discussed as, the sprinkling of Indigenous people through a system, or maybe it's through an academic institution or wherever it may be, to somehow show diversity, to somehow represent reconciliation, and digging into this further on how, placing Indigenous people strategically through a system is not only not a safe practice for that Indigenous scholar or that Indigenous person themselves, but it often doesn't lead to much change and transformation. So that's just been something we've been thinking about more, is how do we move beyond engaging people in a tokenistic way? How do we move beyond that sort of sprinkling approach to true and authentic and deep change towards reconciliation? And I had someone else point out to me too that it's quite cute, right? It's quite a cute metaphor to actually represent something that's quite harmful to people, and really is just a blanket approach that I think we really need to critically consider. And I'll let Lindsay join in on that as well.
Thanks, Brittany. Yeah, I think, as Indigenous peoples, this is probably the one, as Indigenous leaders within institutions, this is one that we come up against quite a lot. And it is a default sort of behavior among the system to do the sprinkling. And so, what we're challenging is to think a little bit differently and really think about moving away from this practice of, exactly as Brittany describes, putting one Indigenous rep on a committee or one Indigenous person in an entire department, and really considering the unsafety that creates. And is that meaningful? How do we do this work in a way where we are progressing and where we are moving towards, an improved process of truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples? And it's not about a single person. It's about a team. It's about investing in teams of folks to do this work. So it's not always carried by one person. I'll leave for Leslie if she wants to comment further on this.
Yeah, it's actually just not a safe practice at all. And, you know, in our particular industry in healthcare, we often, you know, decades ago, I've been doing this for decades now, we would look around and say, oh, why aren't there more Indigenous people in healthcare? Well, if you think about it, it's because it hasn't been safe for Indigenous people to receive care, let alone work in healthcare, right? And so we added one job here, one job there. And, you know, that was the original approach. I'm happy to say it's no longer the approach because we have positions like ours, the three of us, but also we have teams of people working in healthcare. We're not there all the way yet, don't get me wrong. We still like to put one person on a committee and ask them to hold the voice for everyone on that one committee. And this is really the reason why we wanted to bring sprinkles, even though you can read really closely, it says, there are the love sprinkles mix. So it's about love. So I think everybody does it actually in great intentions, with great intentions to bring people to be inclusive. But we're asking for things to be not just inclusive, but equitable. Like, so that there's more voices from Indigenous people, depending on how many, you know, reside in the community, how many are part of the work, or if it's a focus for the end result to affect change for the Indigenous population and bring more people to conversations. The more we have, the better. I think when it comes to tokenization, we are changing things. We're trying to make sure that when we work with non-Indigenous people inside our health systems or in research, we're bringing them along. We want them to be allies, not to go and speak for us, but make room for us. There's a big difference. So if you're an ally in research, if you're an ally in healthcare, and we claim you as an ally, you can't self-proclaim to be an ally. If we see you as an ally and say to you, you're my ally, and I really hope that you will, throughout your work journey, throughout your life, make room for us. When I'm not there at the table, will you bring my voice to the table? Will you make room for me? And I think that's a good start and a good safe practice instead of the sprinkling. The next slide, please. I'm going to just move into that because I think probably when we get to question period, you're going to ask us more questions about this, which is coming up very soon. So we'd like to see your questions in the chat box. So this slide we have borrowed from Dr. Kahulo Kula from Hawaii. And he actually did this presentation on our Vancouver Coastal Health, Indigenous Health Summit that we held just this last fall. So if you want more of his presentation, just go to our website, you'll see it. But what he was saying was we need to challenge and put this different lens and go from the settler safety to Indigenous cultural safety. And we do that with our words and how important all these words that we use and how they resonate with people. Like, I love the one that says, the past is the past, because that is not an Indigenous worldview. Actually, the past is the present. The past is always with us. When we consider anything we do, we're always, as Lindsay mentioned, when we introduce ourselves, we're calling in our ancestors. Everything I do, I know I have my grandmother with me at every moment, telling me, hey, sweetie, nope, do this, do that, right? Like, you always have that understanding. So the past is present for us. It's really important. I'm going to also just hand it over to Lindsay and Brittany to chime in too about what this settler safety means, because it was really it's one of the most thought-provoking things that we had of our summit last fall.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. Yeah, for me, the term settler safety kind of blew my socks off because it was really a description of the status quo. When we look at our institutionalized structures, when we look at academia and healthcare, it is the maintenance of the status quo, and it ties into that sprinkling approach and how we're not really changing the system, we're not transforming it. In terms of that harms of sprinkling Indigenous folks across the organization, and the real work of system transformation does involve changing our practices, changing the way we work to ensure that it is safe for not only Indigenous peoples, but BIPOC and other folks as well. So this work benefits everyone, not just Indigenous peoples. I'll pass to Brittany in case she wants to comment on this one.
Yeah, thank you. The one that really sticks out to me is the culture is a risk factor piece. That's been something that comes out in the research that we see very often. And often how I think about it is that, if we frame that risk factor piece within these structures that exist within the oppression and the historical context and all of the things that have disrupted Indigenous ways of life, if all of those things were removed and Indigenous ways were allowed to be reclaimed, if we were truly able to decolonize, I actually think Indigenous peoples' health indicators and wellness indicators would thrive and go much beyond the rest of the population. And that's because, drawing upon the strength and, beauty of the culture and community as a protective factor, it's the ultimate protective factor that we have the ability to reclaim. And I really see, when we start considering research from that lens and start considering all of the amazing things that these connections and cultural practices give and enrich people's lives with, it's the ultimate protective factor. And so I would love to see research make that shift towards looking at what we can consider strengths, what we can do to enrich those strengths and support those strengths so that ultimately we can move more closely towards health equity.
Thank you both for adding on to that conversation and really just hammering home how important it is for us, especially in research, to stop reporting just devastating data with no solutions attached, right? We want to have the data tell the story from a strength-based process. So if half the population doesn't have diabetes, why? Why do half not have it? Let's talk about what they're doing, how they're, living, eating, keeping healthy. Let's talk about that instead of always talking about how many people do have diabetes or do have other chronic conditions. So that's the kind of the paradigm shift that we're looking for too, as researchers, as we lead a lot of this. What does it take to strengthen instead of just keep talking about the negative? We'll go to the next slide and I'll hand it over to Lindsay for this one.
Thanks so much, Leslie. Translation exhaustion is real. Translation exhaustion among Indigenous scholars and those of us that work within healthcare and Indigenous cultural safety is a real thing. I had a sort of a aha moment when I heard of this work and this concept by Dr. Twyla Baker. And translation exhaustion is the idea that Indigenous peoples or any marginalized person or group engaging with the larger population on a given subject must first set the stage in terms of historical context all the way to current state of affairs before even addressing the said topic of bias just over and over again due to lack of education and background knowledge the listener has, and a direct impact of erasure of true Indigenous history beyond the cursory mention in our school systems. So for this piece in particular, for those that work in Indigenous cultural safety, this is what we do. We try and provide education to that larger population on the past, present, and ongoing history of colonialism. But within the academic context, this does have some other repercussions. And I'll just pass to Brittany to comment on that piece.
Yeah, I mean, this quote just hit home, I think, for a lot of Indigenous scholars, as this is such a common experience. This is a common exhaustion in academia, and also, I think, something that we need to address as a bias across peer review systems. So there have been times that Indigenous scholars may submit an article to a journal, and the level of knowledge that a peer review committee has on the historical context of Indigenous people in Canada definitely has an impact on how evidence, how research is put through in those publishing systems. So I myself have even received back comments from editors saying things like, well, what's a residential school? Well, asking basic questions about the historical context in Canada. And, I often think, well, if this reviewer doesn't know anything about the historical context, how can they actually review my work? Because it's so embedded within that history and that knowledge. But at the same time, it's not the job of an Indigenous scholar to always have to write the entire historical context all the way back to contact to frame the basis for their paper and for their research. And so, that gets me thinking of how can we work with systems like peer review systems, ethics departments, academic departments to have people's knowledge increased in this area. And ultimately that guides what evidence gets published and how it gets considered, and working towards decolonizing these systems. Leslie.
Absolutely, and it is exhausting, isn't it? So for Dr. Twyla Baker, thank you so much for putting this into words, for giving us terminology to use, to share with all of the folks that are listening in today. It really does exist, and I can't tell you how many times out of the thousands of people we have provided training for inside our health system. And the very first foundational part of our training is, it's a history lesson. We go through the 500 years of Indigenous people in Canada, and 9 out of 10 people are astonished and make comments like, I had no idea. And it's like, isn't that amazing? They're usually about 30 to 60 years old and employed in a health system and went through university and did not know this history. So that is astonishing, and it's our responsibility not to be the ones to train them and teach all this history, but to catch them up, point them in the right direction. So that ends part one, where we have actually gone through talking about Indigenous research approaches and a paradigm shift. We've talked about how capital P personal this work is for us and how important it is to us. We talked about the sprinkles and what it means to add sprinkles to your cupcake. And I always say, we've got the cupcake, and sometimes we put the frosting on it. And at the very end, the Indigenous lens gets added and it's sprinkled. And we want to be the cake. We want to be in the recipe at the beginning, not sprinkled in afterwards. We talked about the settler safety and what it means, and we have now finished with understanding what translation exhaustion is, and it comes from all of the others. So Cole, over to you to help us moderate the questions.
Yeah, awesome. We have a lot of questions, and we're just going to try and fly through them as quickly as we can here. Excuse me. So one of the first questions that came up was calling back to what we were talking about before, when you were talking about sprinkling and these committee invites, these sorts of, I would say, acts of tokenism within healthcare systems. And I just wanted to know from each of you as really, experienced and fantastic professionals, how have you managed to navigate these invites throughout your career? As Indigenous professionals, sometimes it can feel as though, if you don't take that spot, or if you don't sit on that council or that committee or whatever it is, then there won't be Indigenous representation in those conversations at all. And it's a delicate balancing act. So how do you navigate that throughout your careers?
Maybe I'll start as probably the most senior, oldest person on this, because I've been navigating. I've been that sprinkle in many conversations, and it really is about being very intentional and grounded in who you are and your intention going into the meetings. And mine is always, I always tell these everyone that works with me, my intentions are set before I go in. Status quo is not okay, so I always know I'm going to be asking for something to change. I just sit there quietly as I, listen in and figure out what the conversation's all about before I ask for that change. So you always want to be ready, for one. The other is we always have kind of a standard line. I do not speak on behalf of everyone. We always want to make sure that we bring in other voices. I say, I will go back you know, to the many different tables that I can go to hear the voices of our elders and residence circle, my team, my family. If I'm talking on behalf of women, I'll go to the Stella Women's Group and share with them the questions or the comments that were made, or just anywhere. We all have our tribe. We all have somewhere to go back to talk and get the answers and the advice before going in. But it is always, I think all of us always start with, I do not speak on behalf of all people, all Indigenous people. I'm here, I'll share my experience and my knowledge. If you want more, I'll go back and find more, or I would recommend that you invite more people to these conversations. I'll just add one of the other approaches that we've done in Vancouver Coastal Health, and I hope others learn from it because I think it works, is we've created a team of amazing experts in all different areas. I mean, Brittany's research, we have patient experience, we have nurses, we have public health experts, we have facility design expertise, we have a physician, and, you know, a whole bunch of experts on our team. And we offer for all others to access the knowledge of this team. Instead of trying to take one person and drop it into your organization, you can actually come to this team and get advice from a team. So it's in reaching instead of just trying to extract and drop. Lindsay?
I don't have too much to add, Leslie. That was pretty amazing and spot on. I mean, for myself, certainly whenever I am approached to participate in a working group or a committee, the first question I always ask the person is, what is your expectation for inviting me? What is your intention for inviting me? And it's amazing, but certainly when you just ask, what is the expectation or intention, you're quickly able to uncover whether, you know, this is tokenizing, or is this, you know, the person's really trying to involve Indigenous perspectives and views, and to do that in a really good way. Yeah, thanks, Leslie, for just flagging that. You know, as an Indigenous person, if I have a seat at the table, I always say I do not speak on behalf of, you know, that's a pretty ingrained line in my brain. And I say that a lot because certainly, again, thinking about my position and the responsibility and accountabilities I have to the sovereign host nations of these territories and the Indigenous community here, I'm a visitor. I'm an Anishinaabe from Ontario. And so I don't speak for exactly that, all the Indigenous peoples in BC. And so just being really aware of my position and my accountabilities and responsibilities that I have to the community. And often it does end with a happy to take this back, engage with my team, or do some outreach and get the answer for you. Brittany, in case you have anything to add.
Yeah, thank you. As far as the engagement on committees, I mean, one thing that comes to mind for me is to allow Indigenous people to feel out the situation. So when being invited to a committee, you know, often one thing we do is just sort of feel it out and meet people and make sure that it is going to be a safe space. So that time to make decisions, to meet and to talk through and get a sense of intentions, like Lindsay said, that's super important. But also, you know, when inviting Indigenous representatives to the table, you know, inviting us comes with our advocacy. It comes with our view and deep commitment to Indigenous people. So, you know, I personally, I'm not just sitting on a committee. I feel like that's quite common, that we're not just sitting on a committee just to, you know, go through budgets and do those sorts of things. You know, I'm sitting on a committee to bring the voice, and I feel a duty in that and a personal commitment to that. So, you know, and I think that's where the sprinkling thing comes in. You know, it can feel token to people if they are brought to a committee, but then not expected to speak up on Indigenous issues and advocate. And for myself personally, I just naturally want to do that. That's what I'm committed to. So if I'm invited to a table, I want to know that I will be seen and heard when it comes to the advocacy piece. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all. We're going to go through one more question because we have a lot of questions that have come in. Just wanted to briefly say for everybody that didn't get their question addressed at this time, we're going to keep record of it and we'll try to get back to it towards the end of the session. So keep an eye out for that. The other question that I wanted to ask was around focusing more on that knowledge translation piece that you guys had mentioned. One of the attendees asked, is it appropriate for allies to train and get educated and assist with the translation of Indigenous history to non-Indigenous folks? Do you feel that that would help reduce emotional labor for Indigenous people in a system, in a setting, either healthcare or research specific?
That is such a good question, you know, because I think there's several depths and levels of allyship. I know I've got a number of people on our team, non-Indigenous folks who've worked with us for 12 years, and I would certainly trust that person to lead some of that and do some knowledge translation. But I really don't think I would advise on it completely. I think that it actually, when we talk about knowledge translation and allyship, it's not to replace, it's not a substitute to working with the Indigenous people, the knowledge keepers in First Nations communities, our elders. There are so many of our First Nations community members who have been raised as the knowledge keepers, as the cultural leaders, as the people that do the interpretation of knowledge and share it in the mainstream ways, in the research fashion. But yeah, that's kind of a slippery slope. It's a great question, and it really makes me ponder a little bit about how deep do I have faith and trust in the ally and how well they are established in understanding. So we don't want to get into a situation where we have that extractive model again, where an ally said, well, I heard this, an elder said this, and now I'm using it. We've seen that a lot. Just because you're at an event and an elder says something does not mean you get to go and use it, right? Again, back to our anti-circle, and the reason why we're sharing information the way we are today with storytelling and this narrative of personal experience is so that you can feel it, right? So it goes in and you feel it, and then you're compelled to some changes and to reflect deeper. So I'll be cautious about how far you go as an ally with knowledge translation without involving Indigenous knowledge holders.
One thing that I've really appreciated actually is that, we've had conversations about how the burden of teaching this history all the time is something that's very heavy for us. When we're talking about this history, our people, our relatives are in our mind and in our hearts when we're teaching the historical context. And so just to add thought to that question, I have had somebody come to me before, say when talking about the 60s scoop, and said, wow, I don't know what that is. Can you tell me what that is? And then actually stopped and said, no, wait, I'm going to go research. I'm going to read up on this. And then I'm going to come back, and I would love the opportunity to ask you more questions about it once I've done my research. And it's not your job as an Indigenous person to teach me all the history. And I really appreciated that personal approach and the acknowledgement of that burden. And I think that's a part of this conversation that we can really move forward with as a respectful way to, not, like Leslie said, not have allies doing all the teaching, but to be thoughtful about learning independently and then coming back to these conversations.
Thanks, Brittany. I love that you just shared that humility piece. I am a huge fan of Senator Justice Murray Sinclair. And so in his words, reconciliation is our shared responsibility. And certainly learning about history of colonialism, there is a piece here too, where there is a personal accountability and a personal responsibility that if you lack knowledge in this past, present, and ongoing history of colonialism, you have a responsibility as a person living on these beautiful lands and what we currently call Canada, to learn this history and be informed. And exactly that, Brittany, in terms of, once you teach yourself, take responsibility to fill your knowledge gaps, then approach Indigenous peoples and have a meaningful conversation, really rooted in background knowledge, and you can engage respectfully and have a really great conversation on a basis of mutual understanding, respect, and trust. And that's how I would like to see this work being moved forward, where folks are just recognizing, you don't know what you don't know, and taking that opportunity to practice humility and educate yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you all very much. I love that last piece there as well. I think that, when we talk about having settlers come in and that extractive model that you were speaking on, Leslie, and I'm always kind of hesitant to support or to endorse those sorts of models, because I think it also endorses this sort of Western view of like classes and getting certification in something and then having that be a check mark and then having that knowledge be considered done. You know what I mean? Oh, I've sat through this course on residential school, so I understand what that is and I don't need to listen to the experiences anymore. I think that taking ownership for your own kind of learning is a fantastic suggestion, Brittany. So thank you very much. But then, yeah, I think that allows us to better frame that as a conversation moving forward. These are emotions and memories and feeling, and they're very real for all of us in a modern context as well as ancestrally, and I think that framing it in that conversation allows for that to be more of a fluid, kind of evolving sort of narrative. But yeah, so thanks very much. Again, sorry that we weren't able to get to all the questions, guys. We're going to move on to the PowerPoint. Sin, can you pick us back up, bud?
Thanks so much. And for the second part, we really wanted to talk about how can we challenge the systems and structures to transform? How do we lay this Indigenous lens and really change the way we work? Next slide. And one of the paradigms to shift is this conversation around Indigenous equity. And when we think about Indigenous equity, we have to really consider where we're at. Where are we at? What is the current status? And, the reality is that Indigenous communities are still fighting for basic equity. There are over 60 communities that still don't have clean drinking water. Indigenous peoples, as Leslie spoke about earlier, we're just struggling to have basic access to healthcare without having to endure racism, discrimination, and stigma. And just having to move through this as part of our everyday lives. And getting back to the personal with a capital P, for BIPOC, for Black, Indigenous people of color, doing equity work is inherently personal. We're brought into these spaces, and sometimes we're expected to share our personal stories and our traumas to inform this work. And really just acknowledging, when we have this big work in front of us around diversity, equity, inclusion, and Indigenous cultural safety, we really need to recognize that these are two entirely separate pieces of work, but they do intersect and anti-racism. And it's important that institutionalized structures really recognize the importance of having established Indigenous cultural safety teams and DEI teams working together collaboratively in order to achieve system transformation and create those safe spaces. I'm going to leave space here for Leslie to describe the scope and the definition of these two things, because she does such an excellent job at that.
Well, they do get mixed up quite a bit. They get meshed together and then seen as the same thing, when actually, as you mentioned, very different. To me, what I usually try to describe it as is the DEI work is really kind of preventive measures. If we get a structural framework in place that tells us to measure things, to be aware of inclusion and equity when we're planning for things, versus Indigenous cultural safety and humility, which is really quite responsive to the dangers out of fear and risk of what will happen and what is happening. So that's the way I kind of say there's a highway and we're in both lanes, and there's an intersection there, and we're trying to get to the same goal, and that is safety for all, inclusion, equity, but more than anything, just safety for all when it comes to healthcare. And that, you know, part of our work as Indigenous health leads, I always remind people we're the only race-based team in the health system. That in itself, if you think about that for a moment, that in itself is really curious, isn't it? Why? Why? Because we don't have safety in these health systems. So they put our teams in, make these positions and make these lovely teams to try to prevent outcomes. And, you know, the cultural safety and humility, the word humility has been, you know, debated for decades as well. Is it included or isn't it included? We do feel like it's important to include that language, because humility allows you to open your mind and heart to learning, right? So again, just really formatting the paradigm shift and the difference between DEI work, which includes Indigenous people, along with everyone else, but Indigenous cultural safety is specific to the Indigenous population and upholding the commitment under UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. It's not about anybody else at this moment, right? It's about the rights of Indigenous people to access and have a say in that care as it's designed and delivered to them, for them. Brittany, did you have anything else to add?
No, I just think, you know, you brilliantly spoke about how these are often conflated and thought of as being the same concepts, and how, yeah, the cultural safety piece is also including decolonizing systems. And if we work towards decolonizing, DEI will also be included in that. We'll follow that. We will have more diversity and equity and inclusion. So thank you, Leslie.
Thank you. Next slide, please, Cynthia. So, well, you have to have been under a rock if you hadn't heard about this report, right? So in plain sight is the truth-telling document done by Mary Ellen Turkle-Lafond and her team. It has been, I say truth-telling for a reason. You know, we have heard of racism in healthcare. We have seen complaints. We've heard stories from family members and community members that have come around and around, and some horrifying stories just in this last year. I warmly welcomed Mary Ellen Turkle-Lafond's report because it was the truth telling. There's no more denying, right? She interviewed and surveyed thousands, her and her team, thousands of Indigenous people were able to record and share their stories of racism in healthcare. So I use this, in fact, it is always on my desktop. It's sitting by me, like within arm's reach, all day, every day. We're using it in Vancouver Coastal Health to create a speak up culture so that when people see it or hear it, they say something. We're breathing life into this document, and I hope everyone that's on this Zoom webinar today to breathe life into this document. Keep it close, read it and read it again, and then read it again, because there is no denying that there is racism in healthcare now. We have the proof, and it's up to us to make the change. I'll often say too, systems are not just these magical things that you just flick a button and they go. Systems are people. Systems are designed by people. System policies are developed by people. Systems, programs, and budgets, there are people behind all of this. So we need people to change. My approach personally has been very much addressing people. I have focused my career on finding friends and allies in health systems to help with the system transformation. I work with the leaders in healthcare to ask them to be inclusive of the Indigenous population and the goals, whether it's in primary care or mental health, or how we build our new buildings to make sure there's Indigenous design elements included, and that the Indigenous, particularly the host nations whose territory we're building these new hospitals on, have a chance to have a say in what they look like and how they feel and how welcoming they are for us. So this system transformation and creating equitable access to care for all people means that we have to ensure that the people that are making and designing the system understand and play a role. So our job, as leaders inside this health system, is not to be the doers of everything. We need to find those allies and those partners and work with them to help achieve that goal based on their responsibility. So if I want to work on primary care, I'm going to find the primary care leaders and talk with them and support them to change primary care for the Indigenous population by working with them. And I can say, absolutely, we've had great success in this area and with this approach. It's about creating friendships and allies and asking them to do something different, asking them to help change these systems, their scope of influence, how we use their scope of influence, how we set those intentions right from the start. I'm going to pass it over to Brittany and Lindsay to add any further comments.
Yeah, thanks so much, Leslie. I think it's really the come with me inclusive approaches for In Plain Sight that we're really going to see system transformation in this way. And again, our role as Indigenous health leaders in this space is really that guiding and supporting others to claim their role, claim their personal responsibility in system transformation, and come with us, work with us, and help us create meaningful change. Brittany, any other comments?
Yeah, I think you both covered so many amazing pieces. I just would add that the day that this report came out felt heavy for a lot of Indigenous people. These stories are our family stories and our people's stories, and it felt pretty monumental to actually have this truth-telling happen, to have these stories brought forward. And also gave us a lot of power in our roles to be able to continue pushing forward this work. This was a necessary piece for us to keep going with the advocacy piece. So yeah, I'm just very grateful that this came out of this year and we can begin enacting the recommendations.
Absolutely. And yeah, thanks for bringing that capital P personal to the report too. You're absolutely right. These are stories of our families. This is stories of generations of experiences, because there was no date stamp on this report. There wasn't, people were welcomed to call in and share their stories, whether they were from yesterday or 10 years ago, which was fantastic. I think it was very therapeutic. And what we're seeing, which also excites me, is a increase in complaints, people feeling like they can file their concerns and their complaints about their care, and we will address them, and they know that. So I think this report has done so much to help us in our work and our goals and intentions, and helping us to be of good use in that system too, to elevate this conversation. And really, the word racism has been so difficult to use in so many cases, but now we can all call racism the racism, and how it affects health outcomes, how it lands for people, and what we need to do to address it. The next one is going over to Brittany. So the next slide, please.
Yeah, so this statement of moving beyond the at-risk vulnerable population and the asterisks, this is something that has been on my mind for quite a long time. I started to think deeply about it when I actually went to a workshop that was about setting healthcare priorities. And the discussion around setting healthcare priorities was just focused on evidence base. We use our evidence base to push forward our priorities in all cases, in all settings. And I began asking the question, well, what about Indigenous people being marginalized from that evidence base? We're often not included in research. If we are included in research, we are considered the vulnerable population, the at-risk population. And that is what pushes Indigenous people to be involved, but also, there's a whole history of why Indigenous people may not be involved in research. And then the asterisk is where Indigenous people are erased from research sets, from data sets that are essential to creating the impact in public policy and in spaces. So the asterisk refers to when the population recruited is too small. It's just an asterisk kind of at the end of research, not included because sample sizes aren't big enough. And we really need to start asking the question of, how do we do this work in a different way where we can actually begin moving beyond these approaches to having meaningful discussions with data to inform systems priorities. And I love what these authors say, Tuck and Yang. We really need to have a radical shift in moving towards Indigenous visibility in research for setting our own approaches. This is the path forward to us really decolonizing research. And I love what Cindy Blackstock has to say when she always says there's an urgent need for us to move towards Indigenous equity in a leap instead of a shuffle. We're going to have to make some big moves here when it comes to data, when it comes to how we represent Indigenous people in the data to inform our equity actions.
Like in no other industry, right? Healthcare is driven by evidence-based data for everything. And imagine the impact when you're not showing up in the data, right? Except for, as we always mention, the devastating data. And really my call to action of all my partners and colleagues across, Vancouver Coastal Health and anywhere else I can reach is please stop continually reporting out this devastating data if you don't also tag on a solution with it. It's got to feel horrible if you think about the woman behind that number, the child behind that number, right? If you think about it that way, then you have to do something to fix it, to change it, to shift it. So this, again, the data that was shared by Mary Ellen Turpelafond and her team in plain sight, 84% of Indigenous healthcare providers reported receiving racism against them or seeing it, experiencing it. That to me is devastating data. And how the heck am I supposed to recruit people into that industry? If this is what they experience, that's the number. So we have to work on this. We have to feel safe, or we're not going to change those numbers. We're not going to change the outcomes. So I really appreciate this this particular topic, Brittany, and you bringing Tuck and Yang to us for discussion. That's the end of section 2. And we have time for some questions again, Cole, and hopefully we'll get a few done before we move on to part 3 of our presentation.
Absolutely. Well, you caught me a little bit. I'm at a loss for words. I just kind of processing a lot of what you guys are saying and sharing. It's so profound. So I think we'll start with, it's more of a general question on the report in particular. We all know this information, as we had spoken about before. We knew a lot of this ahead of time without needing to see data being collected. The question is, what are, in your opinions, what are medical professional opinions about this racism? And how did both sides, both medical and Indigenous, work together to solve the issue, versus only what medical professionals can change? Do you understand
Yeah, there's so many levels to involve, right? So we're trying to do it. I'll just give an example of our approach right now, because we're flying. We're just trying to figure this all out, right? So our approach is really about the existing learners. So the people in UBC, SFU, BCIT, all the universities, all the post-secondary, so partnering there. to try to make sure that the knowledge gets earlier, that we start having racism conversations earlier with people.
Yeah.
Then we have our existing staff and physicians inside our systems, and we're trying to catch up. We're trying to give them the knowledge. We're trying to create, as I mentioned, the speak up culture. We've created a whole patient experience team, Indigenous patient experience team, and patient quality team members that will take complaints and follow them up. We have people working right on the floor in the emergency department watching for Indigenous patients to try to intervene. And then we have all the follow-up and all the conversations that we're having where we're measuring, we put in patient quality indicators and follow up all of our patients by asking them to self-identify, which we also know is not always a safe practice. So lots of work to do, Cole, working with the regulatory bodies, working with the divisions of family practice and the collaborative services committees. And we have had some good success. Lindsay and Brittany and I, along with a number of colleagues, Dr. Eric Grafstein, Dr. Dan Calla, Dr. Kendall Ho, we've created an emergency department Indigenous Cultural Safety Advisory Committee. Just right as soon as this report was about to be launched and the investigation and inquiry, we formed this group of leaders within our system to help lead the way in cultural safety, in calling out racism. And these physicians, they're fabulous leaders in our system. And they wrote a call to action to all of their team members, and we expect them to hold that up, right? To make sure that they're always saying it's unacceptable, will not be tolerated in our emergency department or anywhere. And so again, it's this trying to find the speak up culture without it landing solely on the Indigenous health team and leaders to address this. This is a document, this is the truth-telling document for all the service providers. I'm not a physician, I'm not a nurse, but I will help to hold account the health system to addressing what's in this report. Lindsay, did you have anything more to add?
Not so much. Yeah, I think just the importance of partnerships and doing this work together. So again, as Lindsay spoke, Providence Healthcare and VCH are together co-hosting this emergency department physicians advisory on cultural safety, and together moving through this work. The importance of champions, physician champions, healthcare practitioners, nurse champions, championing this work within their own departments and having those meaningful and challenging conversations with their colleagues, with their family and friends. You know, this work extends beyond the boundaries of the workplace. It really gets into your neighbors or your friends or, you know, family members, and just really starting to have this conversation on a bigger stage. And it really does rely on those folks viewing this work as essential and having those allies step up into this space. Brittany, any comments?
No, you both brilliantly covered it all. The only thought I had was around the shift towards teams, that team approach and systems transformation, and working with people to build moral courage, to speak up when they see something happening in their teams, in their healthcare system or workplace that may, you know, be harmful to Indigenous people or an act of racism. And so once we have, as Leslie said, that speak up culture and people developing moral courage to be able to stand up to these actions, that's when we're going to see a really fundamental shift that we need to see, I think.
Absolutely. And that everybody from the top out everywhere is talking about this and encouraging that moral courage to speak up, that there will be no backlash if you tell the truth, and there will be no backlash if what you say is true, and if you're speaking up on behalf of the people we serve. You know, this is the other thing sometimes we forget. We're in a health system that is a publicly funded health system. The owners of the system are the taxpayers, are the people we're serving. And, you know, we just flip that power imbalance of, you know, there's always been this kind of hierarchy of the provider is up here and the patient or client is here. And, you know, it should be even. I think it should be even. We're all breathing the same air, the same people, right? Let's make this more even, is really what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you both, Brittany and Leslie, for touching on that point. I think the power imbalances that still exist and make this sort of call out culture, or can make this call out a culture, very difficult to do. And I think in particular, you know, when we talk about education, you know, we educate and we talk about increasing this call out culture within the younger generations, and then they enter a system that is still very hierarchical and systematic in that way. And it can be difficult for that setting to translate, do you know what I mean, from their training settings to the professional. But I'm glad to hear that that's being addressed. Leslie, if you could just very briefly, we've had a few questions about this, and you spoke about some of the supports for Indigenous patients that are accessing healthcare services. Where can they go to file these reports if they don't see somebody on the floor? Is there a particular website that we could briefly link, or some other resource that they could access?
Yeah, we're working on that right now, Cole, because no matter how much we make pamphlets or signage or websites and Facebook posts and everything available, we still seem to be a very difficult team to find. So we're really trying to promote that. We do have even an app that we use, and it's a free download on wherever you get apps from, Apple, Google Play, whatever. I'm not very tech savvy, but there is an app. And it's a cultural safety app that has been developed in partnership with our First Nations communities in the region, but also has, we're just getting a refresh that will link you directly to this team. So we call this team the Indigenous Patient Experience Team. And I see some of my team members are putting links in the chat box, so you can find us that way too. They are there. We hope that the 3 of them will turn into 10 of them, because they are so in demand right now. They're Indigenous nurses, so they're patient care clinicians, and I know Lindsay has an amazing team over at Providence as well, and they're there to support the patient journey while they're receiving the care, but after as well. So the discharge planning, what happens when you go home, where are your supports once you're home? So lots of work, and they're not there to take away the work from the teams that are responsible for doing the work. They're there to support the team to do the work in the best way possible for the patient.
Awesome. Thanks very much. For everybody that's watching along, we'll catalog those resources when and if possible, and you can find them on our website after the session. Sin, can we jump up on the presentation again? Thank you all.
Thanks.
So we're moving into part 3, how can we ensure that systemic change is informed by Indigenous knowledge, voices, and traditions? Next slide.
Thanks so much. This concept, Arawaptamak, or two-eyed seeing, is a concept developed by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Bonshor from Eskasoni First Nation. And it's most often encountered in research or other instances when individuals are seeking to incorporate Indigenous perspectives into Western-based values or knowledge systems. And you've probably heard this term two-eyed seeing in research quite a lot. And at the heart of this concept are to see from one eye the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and to see from the other with the strengths of Western values and ways of knowing, and to use both eyes together and equally for the betterment of all. So in other words, seeing through that individual lens that we spoke about earlier, along with this collective Indigenous lens. And this view requires, truly privileging Indigenous voices and views in this space, while honoring the unique and important gifts every team member brings to the work. And so in this way, we move together through this work. This is how we decolonize research teams. This is the decolonizing process is everyone's work, not just the Indigenous person on your team. Brittany, do you have any other comments on this piece?
Yeah, just that this has been a framework that we've been using to build research teams from this two-eyed seeing lens, inviting settler researchers, non-Indigenous researchers to the table to bring their important and unique gifts to this research, while also making sure that we always privilege and honor the Indigenous knowledge and worldview first and foremost when we're doing this work. And part of that creation of that two-eyed seeing team does involve some work, some hard conversations sometimes, working towards decolonizing the research team ourselves before we go on to work with community and do the work. So thank you.
Yeah, Brittany, we experienced this a long time ago when we created our first ever two-eyed seeing research team out in the Stalo territory with our partners at UFB and Seabird Island, and for the team putting it together under CIHR, Canadian Institute of Health Research grant, we purposefully set up the team that there would be an Indigenous PI and a non-Indigenous PI, and we offset the whole team that way. And it was probably the most profound experience of decolonizing ourselves as Indigenous people throughout this process. And this is where that concept of researching, and I can't remember the lady's name that introduced researching to us. I'll have to find it. I'm so sorry. I apologize to her. It is about sitting around that circle of research as we talk about the content and what we're actually researching, and then telling myself over and over again, if I am researching, it means I'm going way back to figure out, what did my ancestors do when they had this problem? And this particular research project was on youth suicide and trying to create a prevention, intervention, and postvention around youth suicide. So we had a terrible spike in Stalo territory of suicide, and we were trying to say, what happened? What is the interruption in our life and the way we are that has happened because children didn't do this in the past? They weren't taking their own lives. So the interruption is the colonization and all the impacts of that. So how do we research and go back to what our ancestors would have seen if a youth was troubled? What would they have done? What would be the solution? So, we really had to focus on that decolonizing of the way we saw things, and how to not only see it and put it into words for this research paper, which became our basket, right? So all of this metaphors, everything that we had to switch our way of thinking to privilege that Indigenous way of knowing, that privilege that those glasses we were wearing when we were talking about this work. It was one heck of a wrestling match, just really staying on task, of never compromising that Indigenous voice, never compromising its importance over the academic leaders that we had on our team. Oh, somebody else has heard about this researching and put it in the chat. Thank you so much. Apologies for not knowing better. So Brittany is going to introduce the next slide.
Yeah, I just love the notion of thinking about our research as something that we want to be ancestor approved, and always keeping that in mind as we do the work, and that's where our motivation and our drive for doing this in a good way comes from. And this is again why we work to strive for research that has a direct impact on not only future generations, but on equity and creating equity. And as you can see here, I have the person walking the tightrope. And that's just representing, Indigenous scholars working within these different worlds, working within academia, working within funding systems and other systems, while also trying to conduct work that is ancestor approved, working within structures, with different competing demands. So often for Indigenous researchers, the knowledge that we're expected to have can sometimes exceed what non-Indigenous researchers are expected to have. So a mastery of all of the Western methods of research, a mastery of quantitative and qualitative methods, while also keeping in mind that we have to master the community work, and we have to constantly juggle those priorities for ourselves, and walk in both worlds. But also the way that success is determined in academic spaces is also often not fitting with our decolonial ways of doing the research. So we have to balance that as well. So we have to consider the fact that within an academic system, there are certain measures of success: how much funding we get, how many articles we publish. And those sorts of things are often just in conflict with some of the values that we have in doing this work. So it's this constant balance of our priorities, and how we balance our responsibilities, and doing this work from our heart center to be ancestor approved at all times and accountable to our people and communities. I'll let Leslie and Lindsay add.
I think I was just so reminded of privilege of voices and who gets to speak, right? And whose knowledge trumps the other knowledge, right? And we had the same situation where, we apply for grants and we say, well, we have to do this community engagement. Well, then the question is, do you really need to go there that many times? What do you mean you're paying an honorarium to those elders to sit in a circle? What do you mean this circle? Why are you giving away gifts, right? Like, why do you have this in your budget? So not understanding the whole gifting and the witnessing and the privileging of that Indigenous voice, and the need to not only get that engagement and putting their words down and getting it right, and then need to go back and ask, this is what I heard. Did I get it right? Before you go and publish and all that other, there's so many steps to do it in an authentic way. And so many times the funders, the agencies that are granting us the money to do this work, will challenge us on, well, why? Why is that necessary? Why do you need to do that? And we say it's actually our ethical and moral responsibility to do it in a good way. And in a good way means making sure that we gift and we honor people for their time. And one other example I'll give is, measuring that quantity and quality of things. So, I always remind people, well, sometimes if you have a matriarch in your circle, you may see her as one. I see her as hundreds. So you have to know that matriarch, that elder, and all their family and their connection to know that person is bringing a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience. You need to know their role, their place in community, their family, how they've lived and held their life in general, to be able to actually say, oh no, I talked to a treasure. I heard from a treasure of information, and I take that to heart, and I want to honor that. Lindsay.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. I just, in thinking about this work and thinking about non-Indigenous researchers, how to be a part of this ancestor approved process, I really think about the other pieces, going back to really honoring that Indigenous lens that your research partners are bringing to the work, and moving beyond listing Indigenous co-authors as knowledge holders and creating opportunities for Indigenous peoples to be co-investigators. So again, really challenging this academic lens of one PI and listing 10, 12 Indigenous knowledge holders or knowledge users, and instead just shifting that lens entirely and really embracing more of a collective and sharing authorship, and or when appropriate, giving that principal investigator to that Indigenous person or group of folks on your team that's really informing that work, and how important that is for equity and research practices.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And Cynthia, maybe we can go to the last 2 slides. So what we leave with you today, I noticed we just have a few minutes left with you. Key takeaways. Next slide, please. Indigenous leadership is more than just a seat at the table, and we're certainly, as cute and sweet as we are not just sprinkles. Remember, we want to be baked right into the whole system. Consider cultural safety and decolonizing as separate and companion pieces to the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And decolonizing research is absolutely everyone's work. And we may be champions in our own right, and we may, use our voice for the greater good to disrupt these systems, but please help with the work. We need all the helpers, and it is our responsibility as a collective to change the way things are happening now, to restate the devastating data into something that is actually meaningful, that will actually change the systems that we work in and the systems that provide the care to us, our families, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and those that we're still dreaming about. Thank you, Cole. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Cynthia, for your supports behind the scenes there. And we look forward to more conversations about this.
Fantastic. Thank you all very much again for your experience and perspective, sharing it with us today. I feel really floored, and many of the things you've shared today have given me some things to think about and move away with myself. I think we have time for one very, very brief question, and I just want to ask it because I think it's a great way to end. If there's time, someone asked, I would love to hear the Auntie's visions of how things would look, feel, and be transformed, if your visions had been realized. What is that state of being? What is that going to look like? Very briefly, to end on a good note.
I really think Brittany should answer this one.
Oh goodness, that's a big question. I think speaking to what I said before, if all the disruptions were removed and all of the, considered all of these determinants of health, that our Indigenous people would be thriving, embedded in cultures and reclaiming and researching those old ways, and just having health that is just flourishing in the systems because they're safe and equitable.
And privileging aunties in that system, because aunties are, in everybody's culture, I believe, that safe one, not your parent, not the person judging you for everything. Aunties, the reason why we chose that word is because aunties are worldly accepted as that safe place to have conversations, and you're going to get some really good advice from aunties. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure with all of you.
Awesome. Thanks again so much, guys. And thank you to everyone that attended. The chat was incredibly engaging, and I'm so glad to see that reciprocal dialogue, and even the conversation amongst everyone in the chat was really rewarding to see. Thank you all again, Dr. Farrell, Dr. Bingham, Leslie. I can't thank you all enough for your time here. And to everybody else, we'll see you next time. Our next session is on May 6th. We're going to talk about cervical cancer research and some things that have been going on in the North. So we're very excited about that piece, and we hope that you'll join us for that session. Until then, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.